In today's video, we are going to be having a conversation about if Evolving Skies is truly overvalued when looking at the singles. Before we jump into it, however, we do weekly giveaways. All you have to do to enter in is leave a like, comment down below, subscribe, and we've got 3 winners each and every week, so you got multiple opportunities to win. Now, one other exciting announcement that we're going to be making is I usually say, don't forget to join the Discord down below, but I'm going to highly recommend you do so because we are going to be starting beta testing for our new Discord investment bot. Yes, it is extremely exciting. I am super stoked that we're going to be able to offer this to you guys. All you have to do to be able to access the bot is hit level 5 for our Discord server by just chatting, being a little bit active in the community. It's actually really quick in order to achieve that. You hit level 2 within your first 2 or 3 texts. Once you do that, you'll have access to test out the bot, and it's going to be something that I think is going to really revolutionize the way in which we look at investing in singles. But once again, this is the beta, so we're going to have a lot of more exciting features we'll be adding to it. And we'll be also taking a poll once it goes live on what the next set you guys think will be extremely worthwhile adding to the bot as the next set to look at from an investability perspective and what you guys think will be the best breakdown. But now that we've gotten that out of the way, jumping into the topic. So Evolving Skies, right? It's a conversation that we've been having forever in terms of reprints. And like I said before, the question ultimately that everyone always keeps asking is, do you think with Evolving Skies singles, is there ever going to be another good opportunity to pick up? If a reprint doesn't happen, when should you really kind of jump the gun on that? Should you be patient? Should you wait? Is there going to be recession that's going to play factors? I mean, so many different questions are constantly being asked about this. So, and that's why I feel like today, let's have a conversation and look at singles and really say to ourselves, how is the trajectory of Evolving Skies singles looking compared to sealed? Because they're telling a little bit of a different story, and that also is going to bring into a later point that we'll talk about later into the video. But jumping into it and just looking first and foremost, the Moonbryon, the most iconic card so far in this set, and in my personal opinion, in the Sword and Shield era. The card itself, if you guys haven't been following it, has actually gone down quite a bit in the past couple of months, leading up to the print of Evolving Skies booster boxes again. It wasn't a big print, it was a tiny print, but it obviously affected the general price of booster boxes. It did not affect the actual price growth of the Moonbryon. The price, if you guys remember, it was around the time of the reprint, early August. It kind of flatlined for a little bit, but then immediately after you had the reprinted product come out, it didn't really drop in price whatsoever. It actually decided to just skyrocket up. And what you're looking at right now is a chart for the PSA 10 condition, which is now worth $900, but at its highest point was worth almost roughly around $1,300. So there has been a little bit of a decline. All this has been, of course, happening while the price of sealed booster boxes for Evolving Skies has gone up $40 in the past month. So singles are telling a little bit of a different story, obviously this being with PSA. Now, when looking at the raw data, obviously, it's showing a little bit of a similarity when it comes to the chart. However, when you go and you look at the PSA 10 price, it looks like more of a bottoming flat line, like it's going sideways. But when you look at the singles itself, it looks more like it's continuing to go up in price after it kind of bottomed out. What is significant about the time of when it really hit its bottom? Absolutely nothing, to be quite frank. So it's quite interesting to see how the market for singles is really in a mind of its own, because it wasn't like a product specifically that had a ton of Evolving Skies was being printed super heavily and causing single prices to go down. Sure, you can make the argument and say that the Charizard Ultra Premium Collection was a box that had 3 Evolving Skies packs, but I don't think that is significant enough of an item like an Elite Trainer Box reprint, like a Build and Battle reprint, like a Booster Box reprint that's really going to crash the price, and maybe crash is hyperbolic, but still bring down the price by more than 20 to 30%, you know, coming from that 570 price point all the way down to 470. So dropping by, you know, $100, so around 20%. Moving on to one of the next cards I think is very interesting to take a look at as well. It is the Rayquaza VMAX. Once again, the Rayquaza VMAX is ultimately telling a different story from the Moonbreon too. If you look at the PSA 10 pricing, it has been up at $1,000 when the set first came out and it first got graded, and since then it has actually just continuously been on the decline. From a charting perspective, if you understand the statement, it is actually just making lower lows continuously. It did have what looked like to be a bottoming point. It did come up, but after it did come up, it came back down. So it looks like the trajectory is, it hasn't made a new high ever, right? Once it's hit its high and it drops, it makes another high, but that high is lower than the previous. Then it goes up, it makes another high, and then it's lower, and then now it's kind of flatlined. So the story of the Moonbreon itself is it had a little bit of a run up leading up to you know, the reprint, and then it went sideways, and then after the reprint didn't really have an effect on it, it just skyrocketed, whereas the Rayquaza just continued to go down. Moving on and looking at the next and last of the three cards we're going to be looking at, Evolving Skies, and then making comparisons with one another. It is the Leafeon VMAX. So this card, once again, it's telling its own different story, which I think is quite interesting because it's really fascinating to take a look at this because there's so many different ways to kind of take this when truly looking at the singles market and comparing it to the singles or to the sealed. More or less the same story of the Rayquaza, but what's slightly different about it was if you look at the Rayquaza, it was a very clean, like kind of downtrend versus this. It was a lot bumpier. It was like drop, then shoot back up, then drop, then shoot back up, and then continue to drop. And you're more or less just seeing that continuation of the drop for the PSA 10 cards. Ultimately, if you look at all three and you ask yourself, okay, what do they all have in common? They're not going up. They're at least going sideways, if you want to make that general argument, but they've all kind of stopped at their general trajectory of the overall price of the singles. And so it's really fascinating to kind of look and dissect that. One thing I also want to compare as well when looking at the two of each, you know, PSA 10 compared to the PSA 9 for all three of the cards. The general value of the PSA 9, on the other hand, has played relatively flat. It has not really moved anywhere, and there's even an argument to be made that the value of some of the 9s are extremely volatile and are more on an upward trajectory. If you look at the 9, for example, on the Leafeon, obviously, you know, 187 was the high, dropped to 102, went up to 147, but then made another high at 203, and then obviously flatlined back down in around the 150-ish price point, but it's not a new low. The low keeps getting higher from 105 to 125 to now 150, 155, and so the 9 values are, for at least the Leafeon, going up. You take a look at the Rayquaza, 192, 215, 233. PSA 9 value keeps going up. You know, take a look at the Umbreon. The exact same thing keeps happening. The value for the 9 keeps going up. The value of the 9 is now at $519, whereas when it first came out, it was $250. So the value of the 9 has actually gone up by more than 100% since the set release came out. So one of the most fascinating parts about the question of, is Evolving Skies overvalued? Is it undervalued when kind of looking at the set overall? It's quite interesting because I think two things can be true at once. I think you can make an argument that PSA 10 cards, generally speaking, having their sideways, can both be overvalued but undervalued at the same time when comparing it to their counterpart 9s, which have done nothing but increase in value, which are extremely overvalued. And what's even crazier to think when comparing the PSA 9 versus the raw comparison of one another is it's almost like an identical mirroring of one another when looking at it for the Moonbryon. The prices are very, very similar. There's basically just a PSA grading fee difference on average between the two. Sometimes even the raw becomes more expensive than the 9, which is absolutely fascinating. Looking at it with the Rayquaza, the exact same thing. They're almost identical in price. Looking at the Leafeon and comparing it to the 9 as well, the raw price is actually more expensive than the TCG player, than the PSA 9 price. So ultimately, when looking at the 9 and looking at the raw, when I had first had a conversation with you guys and I talked about investment, strategy, one of the biggest things that I always talked about was spread for PSA, whether it be PSA 10 spread to PSA 9 spread, and then raw spread to the overall PSA 9 spread. And I said that typically speaking, when going through and looking at it, usually you have this dichotomy where you want at least a 1.5 times difference in spread between the 10 and the 9, and you would like to at least see a profitability when seeing a raw card hit a 9. So hypothetically, for example, if let's say $100 for a Moonbryon, this is obviously hypothetical, it's not worth $100, but then to get hit a 9, it's going to cost you $150, and you bought it raw for $100. The grading fee right now is $15. If you have a membership, you're profiting roughly around $30, $35 before fees. After fees, you're still going to walk away, worst case scenario, break even. And there's a risk that you're taking, obviously hoping that you're getting a 10, but at least you're understanding that, worst case scenario, you're going to break even. But in instances like this, where you start to see that cards in and of themselves with the 9s versus the raws are the exact same price, and you're trying to shoot for those 10s, if you hit a 9, you're losing money. And although statistically, when looking at this graph and it's showing us that there tends to be a lot more 10s than 9s. Don't be fooled by this. It's not that statistically you're, going to have a higher chance to get a 9 versus a 10, or a 10 versus a 9. Although granted, I do think that printing nowadays is leaning more on the side of better quality, but the disparity between the 10s and the 9s, I think, is not telling the whole story, which is individuals are more informed now of what to kind of look for when sending in cards for grading and the value that comes with that. But I digress with that statement, and really ultimately am trying to get down to the point of the matter, which is the value spread, which, like I said before, usually it's well worth it if you have a profitability between a 9 and a raw, and you have that 1.5 times return when looking at it with the 10 versus the 9. You are not seeing that whatsoever with any of these cards. The 9 is roughly about 500 versus 900, so there's about a $400 spread. That's a 90%, 80% return, which is good. Obviously, it's a great return, but there's a lot of risk involved, so you have to find out what the risk to reward ratio works for you. Same thing going with the 9 to the 10 when comparing the two with the Rayquaza. You're saying if you were to look at it in the same regard, it's about 80%. And then it's even worse with the overall Leafeon. When looking at the two, it's about a 70% difference in general profitability if you were to take that risk. And the reason why I come up with that, 1.5x return rate for those people that are wondering is, typically speaking, when it comes to the volatility of this market, especially when reprints happen, you can never be sure whether or not a set is going to become overinflated with that specific card. The price could, of course, end up crashing drastically. And so having a little bit of that cushion where that if it were to drop by more than 50%, you're still going to be secure in your overall profits, even if the 10 were to absolutely dive and take a hit in its general pricing. So really managing that risk to reward ratio, I think, is something that a lot of people don't consider, because they just look at the chart and say, oh, well, if I send it in now, I'm going to make X amount of money. Well, what happens if, when you're waiting at PSA for another 4 months, another 6 months, another year, for those of you guys that were there during the pandemic, and all of a sudden something happens with Evolving Skies and prices all of a sudden crash? Obviously, with some of these older sets, you don't really have to play that game, but, for me specifically, I'm looking at it in regards to the sets that are currently in playable rotation, playable standard, that are not in rotation, since you do have that risk regardless of whether your personal opinion is there on if it's going to happen or not, you still have to at least take into account whether it is a general possibility, because statistically it is, historically been accurate that the Pokemon Company will reprint something as long as it is in standard rotation, where once it becomes out of standard rotation, I think history has really shown that that's very, very rare to actually occur. So taking that as another probability when trying to determine your risk-to-reward ratio. So ultimately, at the end of the day, when looking at this as a whole, I think that it's really safe to say that the value itself of the 10s are almost accurate, I would say. There, you can say that when comparing it to the price of the actual booster boxes, you can almost say that they're undervalued for the 10s. However, the raw cards and the 9s themselves, specifically when looking at the spread, I think that there's a huge overvaluing of both cards as the prices for those continuously creep up closer to the 10. I think there needs to be a general correction there, especially when comparing it to the overall booster box prices, because when it comes to the fact of the matter that the Umbreon is worth in a PSA 9 $520, and the booster box itself is going for $330, and then comparing it to the 10, there's just a lot of disparity there that I don't think is well worth the time from an investment perspective. I think the risk to reward ratio there is extremely poor if that's something you're looking into. One other point I do want to have a little bit of a conversation. This is more or less a lead. This is not something that is officially confirmed, but it's still something to have a conversation about when talking about Evolving Skies reprints. One of the biggest things we specifically talk about, and why I think this actually could be a good correlation when looking at and dissecting everything going on with Evolving Skies, is that we have some sources that have been telling us, one individual in particular who has connections to the Pokemon Company has informed us that the Pokemon Company is less interested in sealed product prices and more interested in the general single prices. So they tend to look at the price of the Moonbreon, the price of Rayquaza, a lot of these big hitter cards within the set. It kind of makes sense because the Pokemon Company is more concerned of, hey, can these, fans, whether it be collectors, whether it be player bases, can they access the cards at a lot more affordable of a price compared to trying to open it, rip it, and hopefully statistically get it? Because we all know, statistically speaking, you're going to be spending way more money trying to rip the master set than you are going to try and buy it. And so it seems as if the Pokemon Company tends to favor that more when looking at, hey, are we going to reprint a set to increase the overall supply, which is going to in turn cause prices to drop. So like I said before, this is something that we're having a conversation about now because of our sources giving us this information most recently. I'll investigate it a little bit more. We'll have a conversation as that kind of progresses. But if that is something that is true, I think monitoring singles and having a video like this where we are looking at the general market of what's going on with Evolving Skies for singles is more important than ever, because then we can say to ourselves, all right, what is the statistical probability or the likelihood we could see something like an Evolving Skies reprint based off of, whether you want to say the PSA 10 is undervalued, or are they looking more at the raw valuation, saying the raw is getting too expensive, comparing it to the 9? Like, what is kind of the thing that they're looking at? Obviously, everyone can have their own opinions and theories in this, but ultimately, at the end of the day, I think it is quite fascinating to see what Evolving Skies is doing as the price for the 9, rather than correcting and, kind of going down, or raw going down, while the PSA 9 price instead has, followed the raw price as they continue to go up, while the 10s have ultimately been the ones that have been correcting and have done nothing but go down or sideways. But that is all, however, for today's video, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you guys all so much for watching. As always, if you want to enter into our weekly giveaways, make sure you leave a like, comment down below, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. We post pre-recorded content for you, so each and every week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And lastly, like I mentioned before, we're going to be introducing our Discord investment bot that is going to go live on Monday. Right now, if you want to participate in that, please join the link down in the description below for our Discord. Hit level 5 by just interacting with the chat in the community, and then you'll be able to get access to test out the bot. We'll also be doing a poll later today to see what the next set you guys want us to add after the beta has gone live and do testing for. But thank you guys all so much for watching. Until then, I will see you all on Monday. Peace.